Three of my favorite things in the entire world are horror movies, making lists, and having an opinion. So here I am combining all three of those and making the definitive ranking of horror movies, or her ranking, if you will. So to start off, I watched the 1987 version of Hellraiser. So I had never seen this movie before, but a lot of my friends have watched the 2022 version that just came out on Hulu. They were saying how much they liked it, but I wanted to watch the original before I watched the reboot or the remake, whatever it's called, the re-something. So I did. So the movie starts off with one of the main characters, Frank, buying this puzzle box from this guy at like a restaurant or something. I thought Frank was really hot at first until I saw his fingernails, and then I was turned off for the time being. Frank then, he's sitting in this like attic with candles like around him, and he's shirtless and like glistening, and I was kind of back into it because his fingernails were clean at this point. He like seemingly solves the puzzle box, and then all of these hooks come flying out and like tear into his skin. The next thing that we see are all of these chains and like blocks hanging with like body parts on it. So then you see this like bald person walking around, like pick up different pieces and put it together, and it turns out to be Frank's face. So from that we see that Frank has been literally torn apart. I don't know what his intentions with the puzzle box were, but I can't imagine that that was it. So then the bald person like kind of strokes the puzzle box, and then everything just disappears and it's just an empty attic. Frank's brother Larry arrives at that same house with his wife Julia, and it turns out that that house was their mother's, but she died like 10 years before. So they're walking around the house, and the house is disgusting. There's cockroaches, maggots everywhere, really gross. They seem to take that pretty in stride. I would be scared. I'm scared of bugs, so like, you know, yes. Julia stumbles upon like a bed upstairs, and there's some like sexy things. So they're like, Frank was here, because if it's sex, it's Frank. Larry has a daughter named Kirsty, who is not Julia's daughter. Her mother died. That's all we get. Kirsty calls him and they're talking. While that conversation is happening, Julia is still looking at Frank's stuff. She finds a bunch of pictures of him and she keeps one. So they do decide to move in. As they're moving stuff in, Julia takes the picture back out, and you're like, ooh, well, that's a little odd. Why would that be? Well, they're about to tell you. In a flashback, you see Frank show up at Julia's doorstep, and it's raining, so he's like all in the doorway, like, I'm sexy 80s man. He is pretty attractive in this moment. Turns out, not only did she sleep with Frank while engaged to Larry, she sleeps with him on top of her wedding dress. Could you imagine getting married and your wife's dress has like your brother's stains on it? It's a little tacky. Also, the sex in the flashback is really weird. Like at one point, like he asks like, can I kiss the bride? And then he doesn't kiss her, he just like sucks on her chin. Like, okay. Anyway, one of the important things that she does in that flashback is she like rubs his fingers on her lips, which is kind of like sensual, I guess. Personally, my thought would be like, where have your hands been? When was the last time soap touched them? Also, like seeing his fingernails in the beginning, that seems like an infection. So while she's up there in the attic reminiscing, Larry is moving a mattress, and there's like a nail sticking out of a wall, and it like cuts him, and he is bleeding profusely. He decides to walk around the house, getting blood everywhere, looking for Julia. She's in the attic where Frank disappeared. So blood drops on the floor. While they're at the hospital, Frank's body rebuilds itself because of the blood. I didn't time it, but it is several minutes of watching this body put itself back together and like regrow, and it is so disgusting. And then there's lots of goo, and so that was enjoyable. So they're having a dinner party. Julia's acting really weird. I think she's just thinking about banging Frank because she was thinking about that a lot earlier in the day. Kirsty is also into some guy. Julia leaves the table and decides to just go wander the house, and then ends up back in the attic. Who is there but Frank? But he's not like fully formed. He's like, if you've seen The Mummy, very similar concept, like kind of a zombie, not all the way there, but needs to like consume more people to like form himself. He asks her to help him with that, and she leaves. So after the dinner party, Kirsty is walking home with that man that she was flirting with at dinner. She sees this guy, like he's in some building, like a warehouse or like a garage or something, and he's just staring at her. And she's like, ooh, that's really creepy. So Julia is like laying in bed. How she like just went about her night, got in bed while she's like, hey, the not fully formed corpse of my brother-in-law who I have slept with and I miss sleeping with is right above me. That's a level of compartmentalization that I aspire to. So Julia agrees to help Frank. She goes to a bar and seduces this guy and is like, ooh, let's do it. And he's like, okay. So they go back to the house. She leads him up into the attic, which like if I go to someone like a stranger's home and they lead me up into the attic and they're like, oh, like we don't need a bed. I'm like, I do. I like to be comfortable. I would have left, but that's just me. She is like seducing him and then he's like, oh, I have to pee, and then she ends up killing him with a hammer. At that point, I'm like, if I have seduced the man and brought him here, you can kill him. Like, why is that Julia's job also? You're the magic zombie. Shouldn't you do it? Anyway, Julia leaves the room as Frank is like doing whatever he is doing. And then she does one of my absolute favorite things in horror movies. When a character like presses themselves as hard as they can against the wall to show how emotionally distressed they are. I love it. I love it. Pure camp. Could you imagine when the Met Gala theme was camp? Could you imagine if someone had come in as like a horror movie final girl or like even a horror villain, like this girl, and they had just walked up those stairs the whole way, just like, would have been perfect. This is why I should just like have all the ideas. Frank and Julia have like a little bit of a moment. She does the finger thing again, which is really disgusting because he does not have skin. Oh, and she hides the body. So she's doing all the work. Julia does it again. This time she is much more comfortable. She is like really in her villain era. She's probably listening to the 80s version of Reputation by Taylor Swift. I don't know what that would be, but she's probably listening to that. After the second kill, Julia is like, you told me you would tell me what's going on. You owe me an explanation. He says that the puzzle box opens the doors to the pleasures of heaven or hell. He doesn't care. He didn't care which, but he says that he couldn't discern between pleasure and pain. He was being torn apart. So I feel like there's a queer, I just outed myself. Oops. He was being torn apart. So I do feel that there was a clear division there because that does not sound pleasurable to me. Frank says that he escaped them and that they're going to come back looking for him because no one is supposed to escape them. And it's really gross because he still does not have skin. And the more he reforms, the more he's just like bloody and wet. It's not appetizing. I was trying to eat during this and I didn't. So Larry notices that Julia's acting kind of funny and asks Kirsty to go to the house, and he's like, maybe she just needs someone to talk to. So Kirsty goes to the house. She sees Julia bringing a guy into the house and then like hears screams because the guy sees Frank and is like, there's a bloody man over there. Kirsty sneaks into the house. Oh, this is the first time you see Frank like actually kind of start it, and all he does is like push two fingers into their neck. You know when you're drinking out of a straw and there's like not much liquid left, but you're like, I want whatever's there. Like, and then it makes that sound. That's the sound that it makes. The guy is like, help me, help me, help me. And Kirsty obviously can't because there's like a magic zombie chasing them. So what's she gonna do? Well, I guess we'll find out later. Frank sees Kirsty and is like, Kirsty, it's your Uncle Frank. It's good old Uncle Frank. And then he keeps saying, come to daddy. But the way he says it, come to daddy, come to daddy. Ultimately, Julia escapes with the puzzle box because she picked it up. And Frank was like, no, give that back. And she's like, okay, well, clearly this is important to you. So like, bye. She passes out on the street. She gets taken to the hospital. And then the nurse is acting super weird. So I thought it was like the Cenobites got her, but no, she's just a weird nurse. So she's locked in this hospital room with the puzzle box. And see, this is where like I would be fine, because as someone who has encountered many a Rubik's Cube, I'm not in danger of solving that thing. So I would have been fine. So she starts playing with it and then ends up summoning the Cenobites. And they're like, oh, we're gonna take you. And she's like, whoa, 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 whoa. You know this Frank guy? And they're like, yeah. Like, if I lead you to him, you can have him instead of me. And they're like, well, maybe. So she's like, that's enough for me. So that's done. Frank kills Larry and takes his skin. I think we're supposed to realize that immediately. Kirsty gets there. She sees Frank as Larry and she's like, oh my God, thank you, thank you. And he's like, oh, I killed Frank. And she's like, huh, okay. So then Julia takes her up and she sees like a corpse with no skin on. And she's like, oh, because it kind of looks like Frank. And I realized on my second viewing that Frank literally took the skin off of him and put it on like a bag. And that was irksome to me. But then she goes back downstairs and they're like acting kind of weird, and she's like, well, we need to get out of here. And then Frank as Larry is like, come to daddy. He doesn't say it the same way, which is unfortunate. She like realizes that that's not her father and she tries running away, and Julia grabs her. He's like trying to stab Kirsty and then ends up stabbing Julia, and Julia lets go of Kirsty. Frank, without hesitation, sucks the life out of Julia. That is cold. So now Julia and Frank are playing hide and seek, which ultimately leads them into the attic. As he is confronting her, the Cenobites come. A bunch of hooks come out and like grab him. And there's this really like interesting visual of like his face being stretched by hooks. It's really gross. Look it up. And then his head explodes. So then the Cenobites are like, we're not gonna let you go. Like, we got Frank, sweet, but like, we're still gonna take you. So she's running from them. Kirsty gets the puzzle box and she like discovers that it'll pop up in like a certain thing if one of them is coming at her. And if she solves it, it like kills them, I think. I don't actually know, but they like disappear in golden light. So I'm assuming. So she's just kind of running through the house. She's getting confronted by them one by one. So then the boy that Kirsty like is kind of dating, I guess, he shows up at the house. He doesn't do much. So then she kills all the Cenobites. And then this is where I get a little confused. So the house burns down, but I went back a couple times to see if I could see when the house catches on fire. And the only thing I can see is like the picture of Frank that Julia like kept and ripped. It catches on fire, and then there's just a bunch of flames on the screen for a bit. And then there's just like an empty lot with like some very well-controlled piles of rubble that are on fire and a chair randomly. So she and the boy are just like standing there watching the house on fire, I guess. She handled the death of her family very well. The speed at which she can process emotions, aspirational. So she puts the puzzle box in one of the piles of fire, which like seemed like an odd move to me because it doesn't look very flammable. So I'm assuming she thought that it would like melt or something. I don't know. The guy that was staring at her shows up and he like goes into the fire to get the puzzle box. So now he's on fire. But it's okay because he transforms into like a winged demon and then flies away with the puzzle box. And the very last thing that we see is the merchant that Frank bought the puzzle box from selling the puzzle box to another guy. I like those types of endings. I like when the ending undermines the conclusion. Those were words that I put together, but I think I stand by them. Yeah, the conflict has concluded, and then the ending like undermines that by being like, it's gonna happen again. Overall, I fucking loved this movie. I thought it was so good. I thought it was like quintessential campy 80s horror. I like that they used physical effects instead of like CGI. I think that adds a different level of just discomfort. I think knowing that you are watching an actual object, even though it doesn't look real, but just knowing that you are looking at a physical object being ripped apart, it gave me a much more visceral reaction. I like that it didn't explain the Cenobites or like where they're from, what they're doing, if they died. I feel like that makes them a lot more mysterious and ominous. And it leaves you with like really good questions like, how do they track people? How do they find people? Where are they from? They're able to make like literal doors into our world and then they close with no evidence of that existing. I think leaving those questions unanswered was really smart, especially for the first one. I really enjoyed this movie. Was I scared? Not really. Well, there were cockroaches. Cockroaches do scare me, so I was scared in that moment. Mostly I was grossed out. I thought it was campy. I thought it was fun. I thought it was simplistic, but not in a bad way. It knew exactly what movie it was and didn't feel the need to make excuses for that. And I really appreciated that. So if I had to put this on like a scare meter, I think I would give it Rudy Giuliani in Borat 2. Like, I'm perturbed, but mostly disgusted. The ranking in this one is a little arbitrary because it's the first one. So right now, Hellraiser 1987 is the best horror movie according to me. And I'm correct. My stomach growled. I'm hungry. Thank you for joining me. I don't know what movie I'm watching next, but I will figure that out. And then we will compare this one to Hellraiser. We'll compare that one to Hellraiser. We'll compare Hellraiser to whatever I watch next. So thank you very much. Have a great day and bye-bye. I love that. Is it still recording? Yeah, it's still recording. Okay. Whew.